a microphone here, but all the time. So welcome to West Offices, if you haven't been here before, and the 2024 York Archaeological Forum Conference. There's no fire alarms planned. We'll just go downstairs and out at the front. If it does go off, toilets are there if you haven't already seen them. And hopefully you've already made your way to the back where there's tea and coffee and water, which will be available throughout today. So make sure you get something, and if possible, try and reuse your cup, because there's only a finite amount of cups out there. We haven't got any catering staff here today. So I'm Claire McRae, the City Archaeologist here at York City Council, if you don't know me already. And I just want to say thanks to everyone for coming out on such a miserable morning and not staying in bed watching on the laptop. Thanks for coming, and thanks for everyone who is watching online. And a big thanks straight away to all the speakers who are here today, and the stall holders and everybody who helps make today a success. And if it wasn't for the speakers, we wouldn't have an event at all. So I do want to say thanks straight away. Yeah, so hopefully you've had a little look at some of the stalls downstairs. You can buy monographs from York Archaeology, and there's publications from other societies and groups down there as well. And there's a few leaflets at the back, and those stalls will be open during the break. So please make sure you go back down there and have another look. Also at the break, we'll have a few finds from the Fishergate excavation, which we're going to have, which is our first talk, and some finds, some replica finds from the Carr exhibition, which Adam Parker has kindly brought from Yorkshire Museum. So they'll be in this room as well for you to look at. It's a quick break today because we're only doing half a day, as you'll have noticed. So please make sure you sort of factor in enough time to do everything. So yeah, we're live streaming the event, as we have done the last few years, on the CYC, that's City of York Council YouTube channel, which means you can go home and watch any of the talks again if you'd like, or you can also watch some videos from the last few years as well. If you just find the Archaeology conference page on the City of York Council website, there's a link to it there. No speakers will be shown on the live stream, so don't worry about that. And nobody in the audience is on live stream either. It's simply the video feed and the audio. There'll be no questions live streamed either. So before I get started on what we've got coming up today, you might remember a couple of years ago, we had Martin Millett speaking about the Roman York Beneath the Streets project. That project has now come to an end, and unfortunately Martin couldn't make it today, but he is speaking on the 22nd of November at the Friargate Quaker Meeting House, and tickets are available on Eventbrite. So he asked me to give that a little plug. So there it is. And today we have some great talks lined up, as usual, and we're starting with Lucy Johnson from York Archaeology on the excavations at Rialto House, which is what the site is now known as, isn't it? It's the Rialto Cinema, the Mecca Bingo site on Fishergate. You'll have noticed there's been hoardings up there for quite a while, and York Archaeology were excavating there in 2022, 2023, maybe 24, not sure if it went into 24. Anyway, Lucy's going to talk about that in a minute, which I'm very much looking forward to, followed by Adam Parker, who's talking about the Carr exhibition at the Yorkshire Museum, which I'd encourage everybody to go and see if you haven't already. And then just before the break, we've got Jane McComish, who is talking about the medieval contexts of the Hungate excavations, which took place a few years ago now, which are in a sort of publication stage at the minute. So if you can keep your questions for the first three speakers until after they've all finished, and then we'll do the usual roving mic and questions for all of the speakers. And if you can hold your questions till then, that would be great. And then following the break, we've got three more talks and some further questions with a sort of a conservation and a community focus this afternoon to change it up a little bit. And then hopefully we'll be all wrapped up by about 1 o'clock. So I won't say any more. I'll let Lucy take over. And yeah, so this is Lucy Johnson from York Archaeology.
Thanks, Claire. Morning, I'm Lucy Johnson. I'm a project officer at York Archaeology. And today I'm going to be talking about the excavations at Rialto House, which is the site of the former Mecca Bingo on Fishergate. And this took place over 2022 and 2023. So I'm sure some of you would be really familiar with the archaeology around Fishergate, but for those of you less familiar, I'm going to give a brief background into previous excavations around the site so you can have some context on what we were expecting to find. I'll then talk about the background of the project and some aspects of the site results. Work on the assessment report is still ongoing, so it's kind of initial thoughts and findings. But further work over the next few years is really going to pull all this together. And then I'll talk about, future plans for the project. So I've used some sources to make this presentation. So here's a list. And in case of the site results, that includes the specialist work as well. So this is the Rialto House development that you can see. It's the site of a student accommodation development. It's named after the 1930s cinema that once stood at the site. And we worked on the project on behalf of the client Olympian Homes and GMI Construction Limited. And this is the site location. So it's at the junction of Bluebridge Lane and Fishergate, just east of where the rivers Ouse and the Foss meet. And although south of the city walls, previous excavations have demonstrated that the area has been quite a pivotal area from the Roman to modern times. Just bear with me a second. Sorry, I think one of my slides has just gone missing. Here we go. So this is the map. And we have our site boundary in red, and then we have the pink dots on this map are other sites which have contributed to our understanding of the area. And then these are also the two main excavations that I'll be talking about in this talk. So 46 to 54 Fishergate was just north of our site. It was excavated in the 1980s, and here a Anglian site of national significance was unearthed, as well as the medieval Gilbertine Priory of St Andrews. And then in the early 2000s, excavations by field archaeology specialists, I'm just going to call them FAS throughout this, just their excavations were south of our excavation area, and Rialto House sits between these two excavations. So I'm going to talk about what these sites have added to our understanding of the area. We don't have any excavated features relating to the prehistoric period, but the site and the wider area lies on a glacial moraine and served as a land route across the Vale of York, and residual flint tools have been found in previous excavations suggestive of prehistoric activity in the area. So this map is from the Historic Towns Atlas, and it shows York 200 AD with the site circled in red. And along this, along the site, there's the road 1/1B, and along this road, cremations and inhumation burials have been found. So this is from the FAS excavation. And and also the area was largely agricultural in nature. And this has been suggested by ditches, and part of the possible Roman road was found in the Fass excavation as well. Okay. The Anglian sites. Oh, sorry, haven't moved on to the Anglian sites. So now I'll move on to the Anglian and Anglo-Scandinavian periods. The Anglian site at 46 to 54 Fishergate was excavated in the 1980s, and it was a significant trading settlement with its location by the confluence of the Ouse and the Foss. It was in use by 700 AD and abandoned by 850. And evidence for this period was also uncovered at the excavations by Fass to the south of our site with a similar date of abandonment. So also in those excavations, the Anglian activity was far less concentrated than the site to the north, suggesting that activity decreases towards the south. And artefacts recovered at both sites are suggestive of international trade links with a range of craft activities undertaken at the site. And evidence for Anglian activity was also found to the north of these sites at George Street and Dixon Lane in 2013. There was the remains of post-built buildings, sunken featured building and a number of pits with, again, evidence for craft working and imported goods showing trade in and out of the site. And after the Viking capture of York, we have some evidence for activity from this period around the site. In the Fass excavations, there was activity of the late 9th to mid 10th, including evidence for crafting activities. And also on Fawcett Street, we had the foundations of a timber building, and remains of churches in the area have origins prior to the Norman conquest. St Andrew's Timber Church predated the medieval Gilbertine Church and had an associated cemetery, and All Saints Church also on at the junction of Fawcett Street and Kent Street, excavated by On-Site. So the name Fishergate in the medieval period was first recorded in the Norman period, and evidence of remains of this period include pits and gullies at the Fishergate house excavations. And then in the mid 12th century, it became a Gilbertine priory, and most of the ground plan of the church was excavated in the 46 to 54 Fishergate site, along with 500 burials. So our site, the Rialto House site, is within this priory precinct. And previous excavations to the south of where we were shown that occupation intensified over the 12th to 14th centuries. And then in the 14th to 16th centuries, there was a large-scale importation of soil to build up the land. So with the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid-16th century, St Andrew's Priory to the north of our site was demolished and the land became used as orchards. This is Speed's map of 1610 with our rough site location in red. And the area largely remained as agricultural land until the 19th century when Freshfield Cottage was built. This was in 1852. Fass also found some evidence of part of the building in their excavation, as well as external features, including an ice house. So these are the later maps from this period. And then in 1909, this is within our site boundary. a roller skating palace was constructed at the site. It later became the Rialto Cinema and Dance Hall. The building burnt down several times, but was rebuilt for the final time in 1935. And it showed films, and it had performers including Louis Armstrong and Gracie Fields. And in the 1960s, it was converted to a bingo hall with many bands playing, including the Beatles. And Roy Orbison and Cliff Richards played loads, apparently, over that time. So this is the Rialto House development. So prior to the excavation, a DBA, a desk-based assessment, collating all of this evidence was put together. An archaeological remains management plan was put together using a deposit model that had been made at the site and this information. And it was basically to inform us how best to preserve the archaeological deposits. And with this information, the development was designed to cause minimal impact to the archaeological remains. This would involve excavating areas where the ground would need to be reduced to a formation level, and then also the parallel locations. And in areas where that were lower and that wouldn't be impacted by the building, we would just plan features so we had a record of where they were. This is proposed plan of the site. So Ben Sabine, my colleague, first led the first round of works in 2022. This involved the demolition and clearance of the Mecca Bingo and car park. There was mapping of the post and medieval soils that covered the site. And then we were really getting into the earlier features at the site. Preservation of the remains was variable. In the southeast of the excavation area, the ground level was higher and appeared to have been impacted more by post-medieval modern activity. In the north of the excavation area, the remains were well preserved in pockets, for instance, where they were preserved by the Rialto Cinema, but parts of the cinema had also truncated the remains as well. So the levels were a bit all over the place. The project was put on hold for 9 months, and then I led the team in September 2023, and we also had site tours run by our community engagement team. And as a result of the works, we identified 9 overall periods of activity with several phases within, within those periods. So the picture on the left here is it's where you can see the area below the formation level where we were planning the archaeology. So again, we didn't uncover any evidence for prehistoric activity at the site, but there is evidence of residual flint tools found in later features. So the Roman evidence at the site consisted of 2 phases of field systems. Many of those were similar in form to the ones that had been previously found by FAS in their excavations, but we also had a larger enclosure ditch. And this was dated to the 2nd, 3rd century. It was observed to in plan to continue towards the west of site, and it turned again. We could see the corner, but it was below the excavation area, and it turned towards the north. And we had cobbled surfaces, and with ditches alongside, but none of them appeared to be in the line of the Roman road, so haven't been interpreted as roads. And then again, like the fast excavations, we had evidence of a fairly high status Roman building in the area through traces of building material and finds, including a small square white marble or polished limestone tessera. So next I'll talk about some of the Anglian finds that we had from the site. Just thought I'd show you some nice pictures of finds. So these were all recovered from pits at the site. So at the top we have an incomplete double-sided composite comb with panels of decoration. Below there's an iron knife, and the coins, the one on the left is the latest actually. It is King Enred of Northumbria, dating to 810 to 840. On the right is much earlier, dating to 700 to 760. That's this one's an unknown ruler of that period. Also at the site we had some dress accessories, including pins and beads, and also household implements, including knives, keys, and querns and stone. And we perhaps have evidence of the reworking of Roman glass as well. We had a fragment of green Roman glass with yellow painted dots that's recovered in a pit from the 8th to 9th century, which is quite interesting, and it fits with previous excavations as well. And then we did have some evidence of antler working. Offcuts have been recovered from one of the pits on site. So then I'll just talk generally about some of the features of the Anglian and Anglo-Scandinavian period that we had at the site. We didn't have a huge amount, but we had, similar to the excavations to the south, we had pit clusters and a possible well. And then also we had the possible remains of a building. I'm being very, I don't want to say definitively it is. I think further dating evidence from samples will work this out. But it seemed to be on an east-west alignment towards the north of the site. So I think further work on in the analysis stage will be able to tell us if that is Anglian. And then in the Anglo-Scandinavian period, again, pits, but we also had a ditch that was located to the very west of site in one of the pile interventions. And that kind of suggests that there might be activity going down towards the west, towards the fosse. So we had a few post-built structures on the site as well. On the left, this is towards the south of the site. There were loads of post holes in this area. It might also represent some earlier activity, but there seemed to be a clear alignment of post holes in this area. And then also another one was located towards the centre of the site, and this cobbled surface was close to that structure. This had dating of 12th century from the construction deposits. There we go. So we also had this lovely cobbled road, and this is dated to the 13th century. it truncated a ditch that was dated to the 12th century, and we've had 13th century material recovered from it. And so there was also evidence that this had been put into the land. Basically, the area had been terraced to create this road. So you can just see here the difference in the topography. So we have the cobble trackway at the bottom, and then you can also see the later medieval horticultural soils that were imported to the site. And then in the later medieval period, there was levelling, as you could see on the previous slide, signalling a change in the use of the landscape. And in the medieval period, there are many, many pits truncating the site. And we think they're associated with the St Andrews Priory activity, where they're disposing their waste in pits. And we have, in the later period, we also have some evidence of like iron working activities as well in the site. So it seems like they're really using the Priory precinct. I've skipped ahead quite a bit there, but in the post-medieval period, we did have some evidence of Freshfield Cottage as well. So we also had the ice house in our site location and some of the remains of Freshfield Cottage, like Bastard. And then jumping ahead to the modern period. So this is the plan of the Rialto Cinema. So this is a photogrammetry model. You can see it has this really bright concrete terrazzo floor to the north. And then it's been quite truncated by the later car park. But then you could see that the large concrete to the south is it's the auditorium. And then you also have the toilet block on the right. So yeah, part of our work was just to plan all of this, and then the archaeology was preserved underneath. And to the left here, we have, this is the orchestra pit associated with the cinema. Only half of it survived. And then above that is the stage where the Beatles would have played. And it was quite surreal seeing it all backfilled, I think, when we had the site tours. So really, the finds that the archaeology that we found at the site, it really ties in with the other excavations in the area. And I think the work in the future on the publication is really going to bring all of this work together, and there's going to be a lot of landscape questions that we can answer. So it's great that we've got funding for the publication. We're also aiming to create a phase plan of the excavations all around the area to be accessible to the public, which would be fantastic. We've had students using the site for their master's dissertations, and subject to funding, there may be a community project focused on the Rialto cinema and people's memories of the cinema. So I'd like to thank Claire McRae, our client Olympian Homes, all of my colleagues at York Archaeology, including the post-excavation team and specialists, and most importantly, the site team, because the conditions on this site were really awful in that silty clay that just really sticks to your boots, and they were fantastic. So thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. It's a really important site, this one, actually, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more on this and the publication. And perhaps some people here actually remember being in the Rialto. I don't know, but it's certainly got legs, this one, and it's taken an awful lot of work actually to get to this stage. Even before any spade got put in the ground, there was an awful lot of wrangling, wasn't there? Ian was involved at the time, trying to work out what to do with this site. So I'd like to hand you over now to Adam Parker from York Museums Trust, who is talking about Carr.
Hi. Thanks. Very good morning, folks. It's lovely to be out here, to be allowed out of the basement of the Yorkshire Museum once again. And this is a bit of a left field turn for what we've been talking about, from field archaeology to what happens to archaeology, what can happen to archaeology a lot further down the line. So bear with me, this is going to be a slightly breathless 25 minutes. And we're going to talk about the Mesolithic, North Yorkshire, and how to build a museum exhibition. So let's go. This is the Yorkshire Museum. If you've never been, please go. It is about half a mile that way. Okay. This is where I'm representing. We opened the exhibition Carr Life After the Ice in the Yorkshire Museum in March 2024. It's going to remain on display until March or spring 2026. In the centre of it, we've been kind of selling the museum off this exhibition throughout part of this year. Carr, the whole exhibition is a collaboration between us and the University of York. The University of York excavated the site and did all the research about it, and it's been my job and my colleagues' job to try and present this to the public and put it into the public domain in a slightly different way. I'm going to talk about that just in a minute. The project and the exhibition, generously funded by the Arts Council, Historic England, University of York through their other funding stuff, and the generous donations of some individual patrons. The project team here is me, my colleague to the left, Andy Woods, who is in Mexico right now, the lucky bugger, and Emily North on the right, who is not at work because it's a Saturday, rightly so. And so there's three of us in the Yorkshire Museum, and I'm here to represent as much their work as I am my own within here. And in this talk, I'm going to be going through these different points about the exhibition. I need to introduce the site. I can't talk about Carr, just in case nobody's ever heard of Carr, because it's a weird word. And there's really some really cool things that we need to talk about. The key findings from the site, how we're going to use this to interpret bits of Mesolithic life, the themes and objects that we use in the exhibition, and some of the design and delivery approach. So this is applied museology on a Saturday morning. Well, what more could you ask for? Carr is a Mesolithic site which is located not in York. It is in North Yorkshire. If you can try and draw a triangle between Scarborough and Filey, it's there. There is a big blue blob in the middle of this map here. This is 11,000 years ago. Britain was at the very end of an ice age. And as the glaciers that covered North Yorkshire and Northern Britain started to recede, they deposited a huge amount of fresh water in bits of the landscape. There used to be a lake in North Yorkshire that isn't there anymore. This is Paleo Lake Flixton. The little triangle on the top left of it is the site of Carr. And it's kind of situated just very broadly on this map on a bit of low-lying land between the moors and the wolds beneath it. Britain was still attached to continental Europe at the time through Doggerland, still very much existed. So Carr was in a very different broad geographical landscape than it is today. As those glaciers receded, it was plant life and then animal life, and then people gradually returned to these islands. And Carr is it is a very, very early Mesolithic site. So it's one of the places where some of the earliest generations of sort of resettlers into the British Peninsula at this time. Carr has been dug up a few times. It was first identified in the late 1940s by a farmer and then a local archaeologist, John Moore, who contacted Graham Clark at the University of Cambridge. And Graham Clark undertook some excavations from 48 to 51 or 52, and he identified the site that's represented in the black and white picture here. It was through his excavations that Carr became internationally famous. Carr is a site that is 11,000 years old. It is not very far beneath the ground surface for something of such antiquity that's associated with it, but it is important because of its waterlogged nature. It retains organic material which ordinarily doesn't exist. It is phenomenally rare to get 11,000-year-old timber and plant life and everything else and bone associated with it. And the discoveries at Carr and the publication that came after the fact really made it as a type site. By type site, I mean it's the site in which all of the Mesolithic sites were judged by. It identified a whole sort of suite of archaeological material culture that hadn't been seen elsewhere at the time, and it really sort of brought the Mesolithic to light in sort of British archaeological studies in a way that hadn't been before. It was also dug in the 80s, but we're not going to talk about that because we don't need to. The exhibition that we built that's on public display comes from the University of York from 2004 to 2015. It was excavated by a team led by Nicky Milner with Chantal Connolly and Barry Taylor. And generations of undergraduates have dug at Carr over those 11 years, identifying both the original excavations and expanding further into it to identify a lot more stuff within it. I'm not going to talk about this in very much at all, but the university have dug this site for 11 years and then have been researching it since. So this is 20 years of research and excavation project within it, most of which is now published. It is open access. This book is free. There are 2 volumes of it. If you want to take a quick picture of that or screenshot if you are watching online, this is where you'll find everything you ever need to know about Carr is in volume 1 and volume 2, published by the university. And it is through those 250,000 words that I distilled a museum's exhibition from. Nobody's reaching for their phones, good. Key findings from this site is the top of which is that, I mean, it's a place where people lived for about 850 years at the very earliest phases of the Mesolithic. People are living very much on the lake edge. I keep mentioning this lake because it is important in the context of the site. We have people who are building structures right on the edge of it. And there is this big thing, this big wooden platform that extends out into it. It's not like a nice wooden jetty that you could run down and jump off the end into a lake in summer and everything's lovely. It's a big conglomeration of interlocking timbers. That's a very organic creation and it extends about 15 meters and the largest one into the edges of the lake. But it shows that people are intimately connected to the land and the water together. It's the shallow edge of the lake. It's where the accessing all the natural resources. The site itself, where there are structures, which I'll talk about in just a moment, is kind of at the edge of a mixed woodland that's predominantly birch, alder, and willow. And yeah, it's this positioning of the site that has made it very important for the discovery of the archaeology. And because it is effectively a wetland site, quite a lot of the material culture has ended up in the lake itself. And then through the process of sort of anoxic preservation, it's been covered in all sorts of plant matter. It's got compressed down, it's got turned into peat, and it's been captured in time for the last 11,000 years until it was excavated quite recently. If these people weren't living at the edges of the lake and putting it into there, we wouldn't have the evidence from the site as it is. There are structures from it. It's an archaeology conference. Let's show post holes. Yes. The picture on the left, do I have a pointer? I do have a pointer. Aha, I will point. Sorry, folks online. There are 6 post holes represented in this this thing here. These are timber post holes that are about 2.5 meters across. This is a structure as represented in the reconstruction of the thing on the right. This is the oldest permanent, the oldest evidence for a permanent structure in Yorkshire. It's the first house in Yorkshire. 6 post holes in the ground on the floor. Isn't that great? There's also a big recess in the middle of it, a big kind of kidney bowl shaped thing in the middle where there's sort of a pit where different things are happening in. There's another excellent open access paper just published last month by Jess Bates from the university team, which identifies that these structures where people are living in, there are enough of them and they've done enough microanalysis on flints in them to identify that there are different spaces in the houses where people are doing different bits of technology. In one of the houses, there's like a butchery corner, and there's another one, there's like a plant working corner. It's really, really cool stuff. And it's only because of the sort of the preservation at Carr that we're able to identify this sort of material. The research is still ongoing and it continues to be cutting edge. We find out more things about Carr all the time. We do, well, the university do. Because of this big wooden platform, there's a sort of a zoomed out picture of some of it. This and the houses together is the earliest evidence of carpentry in Europe. I keep talking about the earliest. Carr is the earliest everything. It's got so many of these kind of big headline important priorities about it. It's the earliest evidence of carpentry in Europe. Given that the size of some of the sculpture, some of the structures and the longevity of the site, it shows that there's also quite a lot of community engagement, that there are people building projects together. It's not just one person, you know, a generation after generation. These are people come together to build these things and maintain them. And for the life, this big platform here exists for about 100 or 150 years within it. There is what there isn't at Carr is people. There are no human remains that have been identified at the site. There are other Mesolithic human remains in Britain and the continent. But we do have these nice little vignettes, little bits of creativity, things that are created for artistic endeavor. This is the Carr pendant. I'll talk about this again latterly. But it is, yeah, it shows us the challenge that if we can't get at people, how are we trying to show and represent what Mesolithic people were doing other than just living and building stuff? It's not quite as black and white as that. There's also quite a significant amount of evidence for hunting. This is a barbed antler point. This is the back of it, not the pointy bit. The pointy bit's on the left, but it's got some nice little hatch marks on it. There are about 200 of these things found. This is hunting technology. There are also bits of bows and bits of arrows, which I'll come to in a minute. So these are just the key findings from the site. During Clark's excavations in the 50s, he identified about 20 antler headdresses. So these are big red deer frontlets, the frontal bone, and these things are interpreted as something that people wore on their heads. It was a headdress, and they became images of the Mesolithic. They became internationally renowned as things that was a picture of what this period is. The recent excavations found some more. So there are now 33 known from the site. I think 15 in the recent excavations, and there are 12 from the rest of the Europe. There are more represented in this picture than you can see anywhere else altogether. So, the key findings from the site. Now, what we're going to do with it. There is obviously, this has been dug for 11 years. There is an archaeological archive. The excavations identified something like 80,000 individual flints and 40,000 bits of timber. We haven't retained all that because that is far, far, far too much. We have something like, I think, 6,000 flints and a couple of thousand bits of wood. About 10% of those 40,000 bits of timber had been worked. And it is retained in part of the archaeological archive now. And so we have sort of a duty of care to it. And it's definitely one of the largest Mesolithic assemblages in the country. It's awful. It's terrifying. It's excellent, these things that are within it. So once that archive has been deposited, it is now my job to curate it, to look after it, and to ensure it is going to be still in excellent condition for the next at least 100 years, and hopefully much, much longer. But also to be able to use it to tell a story. So we create an exhibition about it, Carr Life After the Ice, which is an exhibition very much built in collaboration between the Yorkshire Museum team and the University of York team, and we've been working there together. I mean, the exhibition team is quite broad. There's about 15 people on it, wearing different hats through curatorial, public engagement, communications, etc. There's very much a multidisciplinary team. I mention that because this isn't all my work within it. To be able to create and sell an exhibition, we need to have a specific theme that's running through it, and it's the archaeology and the research shows that people have a very close relationship with nature, that it was a complex and changeable period 11,000 years ago, and that this archaeology is frankly amazing. And that is the theme that is going to run through everything else within it. There are very definitely specific challenges with doing anything with this period. It's that the words prehistoric and definitely Mesolithic are not very well known in the public domain. They are not. We've also put this exhibition in the Yorkshire Museum. We're in the centre of York. You might be familiar that the York's visitor market, particularly tourists, is mostly about Romans and Vikings and the medieval period. People don't come to York to see prehistory. I don't know where you meant to go to see Mesolithic, other than since we did this. But people are generally unfamiliar with these two topics, and this is a specific challenge that we have to try and address by creating an exhibition about it. But there are obviously preconceptions about hunter-gatherer communities and societies. There are all sorts of challenges with the objects which just want to fall apart all the time. They are unbelievably fragile, and yeah, there are, of all the objects in the York Museum's trust, these things are the things that I like handling the least. They are terrifying to be able to do anything with. So we've got to keep a very close eye on them, make sure that our environmental conditions are appropriate, that there is good conservation care and consolidation of these materials. And of course, there is always a challenge about resource. We're a charitable museums trust. This exhibition cost about £70,000 to make. maybe you think that sounds like a lot. It isn't. I would have liked 200 to be able to do it. So we have one room and this budget, and that will get you an exhibition in about 12 months. That lasts 2 years. And that's about it. Like, very, very, very briefly, the whole exhibition is built around, this is a really boring slide, I'm sorry for this. This whole exhibition is key to specific audiences. As a museum organisation, we have an audience development plan. So we've identified the kind of groups that we're trying to target for this exhibition to get them to come into the museum. And these are the peak audience and the off-peak audience. Wow, somebody earned their money that day, didn't they? The peak audience is the York families and tourists. This is the Saturday morning crowd, people who are in the museum right now. Often bringing young families to York for a day, or they're here for a weekend or on a family holiday. The off-peak audience is the Tuesday afternoon crowd, which is people who have often from generally older, usually from in and around York and North Yorkshire, and school groups. I mentioned these three things because these three groups want different things in an exhibition. You have to be able to give them different bits of information to be able to tell that story in different ways. These three groups very much need different resources for it. How we opt to tell the story is actually looking at all that material and look at all that research and saying, right, there are probably 4 main stories that we can tell here. Going to have to introduce the Mesolithic and the site to everybody. So we're going to just take it as read that we're going to do that. And those 4 themes are that settling, eating, creating, and believing. The idea that settling is a story that people have come to this space and have built some of the earliest houses in Britain, and that this is almost a permanent resident and people making the home here for the first time in Britain's history. There's a key object that is going to be associated with all these themes, which helps to tie it together, and that in this instance is going to be the platform, which is because, not necessarily the structures, because the platform really ties that whole site together. It shows that people are in this space and this space is unique to them and important to them, and the platform is a really unusual thing to find in and of itself. Theme of eating, I mean, it's just a essential human characteristic that people will be able to identify with, but that we can show that people had this link to this idea that people had a deep and meaningful connection to the natural world, and they are hunter-gatherers. They are going out into that Yorkshire, Mesolithic Yorkshire landscape, and they are using their tools and their knowledge to be able to find and exploit a range of food and resources. And our key objects of this are the 2 most important sticks in my exhibition. The thing that, if you haven't seen these pictures are not quite to scale. And the one at the top definitely needs a rebrand. It's called a digging stick. It is a stick which you use to dig things. It's got a pointed end and it's got a handle end. And the one at the bottom is the oldest hunting bow in Europe. Both we know that these objects are what they are because of experimental archaeology and the university's approach. So quite a lot of our interpretation on this exhibition about Carr has relied on the university testing it, trying to identify what some of these objects are. So they have recreated the hunting bow and the digging sticks, and then they've also drawn on ethnographic parallels to be able to identify similar objects amongst existing hunter-gatherer societies. And this kind of builds a picture about what some of these things are for. The theme of creating, we come back to the Carr pendant, which is a really intricate little object. It's the oldest Mesolithic art in Britain. Hooray, another oldest. It's got a different series of interconnecting lines in it. There are these kind of elongated, the long ones, and then the short ones that spin off it, and then a series of tiny ones just come off the edge of it on here. This object, more than any others, helps us ask a question about how, what, because of many of the things, I have absolutely no idea what this thing is for. We often ask the question, what do you think these objects mean? Or people tell us anyway what they think they mean. I have absolutely no idea. I think identifying the limits of our ignorance when talking about the Mesolithic is quite an important thing to do. But this is a really interesting object that helps people find a way into the period by asking questions about how they use it or what they think it was for. For the record, the theory, the different things I've heard, that it's a map of Carr, that it's a representation of some of the platforms, that it's a calendar, that it's a counting system, that it's just pretty, or that it's somebody saw a face. There's definitely a duck there's a weird duck face in it somewhere, some wings and a thing within it. So yeah, people see all sorts. And of course, believing, we can't do an exhibition about Carr here without talking about the most important objects from the site. Yeah, there are 11 of these things now on display here, and literally less than 50 in the entire world. So there are more of them on display in the Yorkshire Museum than you can see anywhere else. Isn't that cool? The headdresses are mostly made of red deer. So these big ones in the middle, that's a red deer. All the bone on the front of it has been removed. The antlers have been split in half, and they do usually have some holes drilled into them, which have been related to being worn as a headdress. There's a reconstruction picture on the right, which is based on a reconstruction of a grave in Halle in Germany, of a inhumation grave of an adult woman, which has one of these little the little roe deer ones, the little fascinated type version. And she, in the grave, this lady was having this, and she had loads of cool bone sort of pendenty things around her, which might tell you that these are not the whole story. The reason that we have these objects is because of that relationship with people on the platform. These are found broadly together, but they were intentionally deposited off the edge of the platform into the lake. These are things that have been, they're not broken, they're not smashed, they're not buried in pits in the ground. They are left not very far from where people are living at the site, very much off the edge of that platform, and when they reach the end of whatever their functional lives were. And they're often kind of grouped together. So there's a very sort of intentional act. That's these things are kind of a giving back to them. We'll not dwell on that. Again, the university, because of course they did, wanted to recreate these. So they got a deer skull and packed it in clay, put it on a fire and tried to split the antlers. And it's doing this sort of research that helps us tell some of the stories in the museum, which is that by doing this, you can check the microwear and the damage on the edge of it, compare that to the existing ones, and you can do kind of a compare and contrast to say, yeah, this is probably a pretty good indication of how you would make one of these things. So in my 5 minutes, let's actually talk about this exhibition. Our design, we have a particular problem in the Yorkshire Museum, is that in the space that we're going to put this in, which is in the central hall, if you're familiar with it, which is a big open space with neoclassical columns in the center of it. It is an awful space to try and put people into the Mesolithic. There's a much overused phrase in museums, which is try to make it immersive. We never tried to make this immersive because I think the space and the content of it doesn't necessarily work for it. But there's an intentional approach here that there are specific colors that are being used that link back to the natural world. So it's all green and orange and blue, that there are colors that link to the lake and the platform. And there are these sort of volumetric structures that are recreated in the space. And this is what it actually looks like. So we have these big sort of tent things, which is meant to give a sense of the size of some of the buildings. There is a very stylistic version of a platform in the center of the building, in the center of the floor, and a green bit, which represents land, and a blue bit, which represents the lake, and the bit of the platform was on the lake, and then the headdresses at the far end, they're deposited in the lake. So there's kind of a little sort of nuance that's associated with the site archaeology that's re-represented in parts of the exhibition. There are only 11 cases in this exhibition, and about 200 objects, so it's not very many in terms of the rest of the archaeological archive. Obviously, we have to write something about it to be able to explain this to people. We have those different audiences who all want different things. There are 3 different layers of interpretation. There is the main level, the central one, which is every section has a big panel that contains no more than 60 words, and every object label contains no more than 40 words, and every object does have a label with it. There are a different strand. There's a sort of an easier access strand underneath it and a more in-depth strand above it. Two of the most common complaints I've ever had in the museum is that there is too much text and there is not enough text, which tells you, so maybe we're doing something right, you know, between these two things. This is what one of the actual cases look like. This is, yeah, have to be able to describe all these objects in 40 words. The entire exhibition comes in at a word count of about 6,000 words. So it's not really excessive as a whole space, and about a whole story about the Mesolithic. It started at about 20,000 words, and we had to very much dig it down and down and down and down and down. But this just gives you a little sense of, this is kind of the main way that people access it. Many people do go into museums and read absolutely everything. About half the people that do it. This is sometimes called like young people's interpretation or stuff for kids. It isn't. Everybody likes playing with the old things. So there is a lot of the replicas that So it's experimental archaeology that the university have undertaken, resulted in the creation of a lot of replicas. Those are on display. I've got loads of them that I brought with me and come play with these toys during the break. So we really want people to be able to engage with objects, to be able to kind of get a bit of tactile feedback from the Mesolithic. It really helps answer the question of what is this thing for? How did you do it? Everything else about it. It raises and answers both important questions of people being able to do it. And there is a level of interpretation for people who want to know more. There is mini essays, these digging deeper panels, which are about 500 words each. And there is an actual book that tells you about the exhibition, which Nikki threw together in about 4 minutes, as far as I can tell. It's unbelievable. I'm probably going to run out of time to do this bit. We'll be very, very quick. My favorite bit of all this exhibition is actually none of the objects. It is this huge 3-meter long digital mural that's been created. Our mission was to create life after the ice. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to actually sort of recreate a little bit of what the space looked like. Well, I absolutely don't have time to do this. So we're going to go to the next one. We'll go to the next one. I've got some pictures about this. Go to the Yorkshire Museum and see the digital mural. I'm sorry? Am I? Oh, all right, great. Cool. Let's take a liberty then. Okay, I need like 30 seconds of this. So I need to explain a little bit about this. This is created by Guy Schofield. Skip forward about 45 seconds where we want. And what you have is, so this is called a digital mural, so it's not a video. This is the digital landscape that's recreated in collaboration with the university. So this is based on the archaeological footprint of the site. It is a thing that runs every 20 minutes. It goes through different seasons. Like the level of the lake goes up and down. There are about 500 different interactions that will happen, and they are randomly generated when people come in contact with it. So it's not a video, it's a constantly changing, emerging environment. There are things that I've still never seen that are so rare and kind of the events of it. There's meant to be a giant fire in the background at some point. There's a very brave deer keeps walking into the middle of this thing. When you've seen the headdresses, I'm not really sure what it's doing. But as a way of drawing on some of those different audiences and telling people what life in the Mesolithic actually looked like, being able to represent it like this and then associate that back to the objects, these things been made in dialogue, that's actually very powerful for us to be able to do that. So what are you doing? Go. All right. Very quick, very quickly. There's a little bit of program associated with it. Over August, you may have seen or heard about this. We built another house in the museum gardens as part of the experimental archaeology. It's been filmed. It's going to form part of a research project. Research project and public engagement, hand in hand. Looks different to the first one because there's been some different techniques have been tried for it. And something like 10,000 people came and walked inside this thing over the course of a month. It's wild. And more people engage with the Mesolithic outside of the museum than we had done inside of it. There is a lecture series that is going to be associated with this. I mentioned this one because it is next week, and this is free. You come to the Yorkshire Museum if you'd like to hear more about the Mesolithic with one of the excavators from this site. By way of summary for this, like I said, slightly breathless introduction, at the Yorkshire Museum, we've had to create this exhibition by bringing together some quite difficult archaeology, but which has an incredible story of survival, both in terms of its material and also what the story that it tells. There's a very kind of Yorkshire flavour to this as well, that is of international importance in the research community. Everything that we've done has been informed by the excellent research of the university, and hopefully we brought that together to create a space that is kind of accessible and interesting and memorable for people. And if you haven't seen it, please go and do that. Thank you very much. Right, sorry.
Thanks, Adam. That was great. If you want to go back and look at any of those links that Adam mentioned for the publications, like I said before at the start, you can look at that, watch that video again on the City of York Council YouTube channel. So up next we have I just want to remind everybody as well that we have some finds with Lucy at the back during the break, and Adam will be down here at the front with some of his replicas that you can throw around and look at the digging stick, etc. at the break time. So next we've got Jane McComish, who is, where's the clicker? Who is talking about Hungate excavations. What's happened?
Yep. So on bit 2.
No, we're on 1 still.
Okay. So I just stop.
Yeah, so Jane McComish from York Archaeology, who's going to talk about the medieval context at Hungate excavations, which took place a few years ago now, which I'm sure some of you remember.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the medieval context in Area H of Hungate, which is this plot that you can see right smack bang in the middle of the image there. York Archaeology has recently published all the Roman context from this site, which is on sale in the foyer downstairs, I hasten to add. So the next thing to do on our publication list is to sort out the medieval context, and that will eventually be followed by a publication about the post-medieval and modern context at the site. It's not working. Not working. Where's he gone? Sorry about this, folks. Technical problem.
Sometimes need to wake you up.
Right, okay, thank you. Sorry about that, folks. Right, so this is where Hungate is located, in this bend in the River Foss here, and this is the site in a bit more detail. And Area H is that massive diamond-shaped trench you can see in the middle, and also here. Area H is about 50 metres square, and as such, it's one of the largest trenches we've ever excavated in York. But it's one of just many trenches that were excavated in the Hungate area between 2000 and 2018, which are shown on this one here. So there are 36 trial trenches, which are the little trenches you can see in black, red and orange scattered all over the place. Next thing was an excavation at the Henley's garage site up there. Then we had the main phase of excavation, which are these sort of pale yellow ones that you can see all over the area, including Area H. And then we had two further excavations, one here and one here. Now, the intention is to publish all of these excavations in one volume, so it's going to be a massive amount of work. But today I'm going to concentrate on Area H because that's what I've been working on. So what did we find in Area H? Well, in the Roman period, in the Roman period, it was used as a cemetery. And when that cemetery went out of use, the site seems to have been abandoned. And a layer of soil built up across the whole site. It could have taken centuries to build up. And it's very badly truncated by later features. But what survives of it is the stuff that you can see in purple and khaki on this image. Next thing we get is a whole series of pits. They're very heavily truncated by later features. So usually all we got of them was just the bottom of the pit or a little bit of it. None of these had any datable artifacts in them. The ones in green are sealed by features of late 9th to 10th century date, and the ones in blue are sealed by features of 10th century date. So these pits could either be Anglian or Anglo-Scandinavian in date. There are some post holes scattered about at this stage. Most of them are isolated, like one up there, and there's another one in there. But there are a couple of sets of stake and post holes that look like they're little structures. So one of them is up here, and it's this one you can see here. And it's just a sort of L-shaped arrangement of stake holes with a big post hole at the corner. Nothing else survives of this, so it's very difficult to know what it was, but it doesn't look like it was anything very substantial. The next one is down in this area here, which is the one you can see here. And again, you've got an L-shaped arrangement of post holes, including that purple one there, with a little line of stones inside it that may be some sort of footing for an internal partition. Again, there are no floor surfaces associated with this, so we don't know what it was used for. I should just add that those two post holes there are slightly later and not related to it. The positioning of this is quite interesting because it might imply that Hungate existed at this stage. Hungate runs, the present one runs just outside the area of excavation here. So it's very easy to imagine that this building was put in relation to an earlier version of that street running down there. Then we've also got a group of features in orange at the top, well, it's brown on this slide, at the top of the site. And if we have a look at those in a bit more detail, They are a combination of 3 burials, a rather strange little structure interpreted as a mortuary structure, and a few post holes and a beam slot, all of which are on exactly the same alignment. So if we look at the burials first, this one is that one there, and this one underneath it was put in next to it. We had the most northerly of those carbon-14 dated, and it gave a date of AD 870 to 980, so it's solidly Anglo-Scandinavian. A few metres to the south, we've got a 3rd burial. That one there is this one. It's a slightly unusual grave in that it's got stones lining it, and it's also got a series of post holes around the outside of it, as if it had some kind of mortuary structure associated with it. Then we've got this curious thing down here. That's it in a bit more detail. And it consists of a rectangular cut. Oh, sorry. It consists of a rectangular cut which has a stone wall lining it. And then within it, there's a little rectangular feature which had traces of a wooden lining all around the sides. And it was interpreted at the time of excavation as a coffin. If it is a coffin, it's way too short to be for a fully extended adult. So it was either for a child or it was for a collection of charnel bones. It's surrounded by a series of post holes. The ones in this area have been truncated away by a later feature on the site. One of those post holes contained a piece of 10th century pottery in the backfill. So this thing clearly went out of use in the Anglo-Scandinavian period. And it's possible that these 2 little post holes here, oh, sorry, I keep doing that, sorry. It's possible that these 2 post holes here represent a door frame giving access into this building. It was clearly robbed out sometime, and that's why part of the wall is missing, and it may also explain why no bones were actually found inside this feature. Then we've got a line of post holes that you can see here, and this beam slot that you can see down here. The beam slot was packed full of daub, which presumably originated from whatever structure this represents. We can't tell if the beam slot and the post holes are from a single building or not. We don't know if these features collectively represent an attempt to create a church and a cemetery in the Hungate area during the Anglo-Scandinavian period, but if so, it clearly failed because this area very rapidly turned over to secular use. The other alternative is that the burials up here represent outliers to the Church of All Saints Peas-on Green, which is slightly to the northeast. So the next thing that happens is a succession of 9 phases, all of which are very similar. Each phase consists of alternating layers of burning, ash, dumps, little thin layers of trample, and then on top of them you get little post holes and stake holes indicative of very sort of ephemeral structures. And then that whole process repeats itself again and again and again and again. So these 9 phases, you get the blue ones, then the green ones, then the pink ones, then the purple ones, then the yellow, then the khaki, then the brown, then the green, and finally the last of these phases. I'm so sorry about this. I keep pressing the wrong button. The last of these phases is this one that you can see down here. Now, all of these phases are dated rock solidly to the late 9th to the late 10th century. So it's an awful lot of activity in a very short space of time. And it's perhaps best interpreted as people disposing of rubbish in middens and then burning them, and then more rubbish, more middens, more dumping, few little ephemeral structures, and just repeating that process over and over and over again. And this is a cross section through those deposits. And you can very clearly see the black layers of burning within it and the red layers that represent ash and burning. For the first 5 of these phases, there's very little structural activity on this site. As I said, just a few ephemeral post holes, little sort of flimsy structures. But then in the 5th phase, we start to get slightly bigger buildings. There's one there and there's one there, and I'll show you those in a bit more detail in a minute. And then in the 7th phase, we get the site being divided up into different properties. So that line that you can see there is this feature here. So it's a line of post and stake holes, clearly some sort of boundary, and the line here is a gravel path. So at this stage it's been split into 3 different properties. So if you have a look at these early buildings first, these 2 buildings here are these 2 buildings here. They're very similar. That was the first of the 2, and it's where that puddle is on the photograph there. And then the green one is this pit you can see here. So it's a deep trench with post holes down the side of it. Now, unfortunately, both of those are largely outside the area of excavation, so we don't have a full ground plan for them, and we don't really know what they were used for, but they're clearly semi-sunken buildings. We do, however, have a full ground plan for this one, and you can see it's a rectangular pit lined with posts, and then on this side, you might just be able to see that very thin line. That's what's left of horizontal plank walling that lined that pit. And then on this side of it, you've got a little extension with what are clearly steps down into that pit. So it's definitely a semi-sunken building. It wasn't in use for very long before it was backfilled, and that brown splodge there is the backfilling of it. And then they started building another building exactly the same just to the northeast, which is this trench that you can see being excavated here. For some reason we don't know, they abandoned that mid-progress, they just left it, and then they built another building slightly to the northeast of that, and this is what remains of it. It's very badly preserved because another building was put smack bang on top of it, so all that we've got left of it is two sides, and again you can see post holes associated with it, and that wiggly line is what's left of the timber plank walling. And in the case of this one, the little entranceway, the stairs would have been here. To either side of it, there was a little stone wall, and that's one of those stone walls there. Sorry, done it again, press the thing again. So if we just have, sorry, I've just done that one. There we go. So the next thing that happens is this phase here. And this is clearly a planned suburb, no doubt about it. It's got at least 8 tenements fronting onto what must have been an earlier version of Hungate. So if you imagine Hungate down here, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, probably a 9th one here. These exist mainly at the southwestern end of the site. You've got these clear tenement divisions. Most of them are gullies, but in the case of this one, it's a gravel path with a fence to one side, and in the case of this one, it's another gravel path. But all these others are little ditches and gullies, splitting the site up into tenements. Now, most of these boundaries don't carry on into the northeastern half of the site. The only one that really does is this one here. You can see that gully lines up with those post holes very nicely. And it's possible that this path originally went right the way across the site as well, but that it was removed in this area by a later medieval road. You can see that there are buildings in 3 of these tenements near to Hungate. There's one there, and one there, and they're very similar to the buildings I've just shown you. It's worth noting that if Hungate is down here, none of these 3 buildings actually front onto the street. They are set back a little bit from it. So if we look at the northeastern half of the site up here, there are, again, a lot of buildings here. And although there aren't tenement divisions, they clearly line up with the tenements closer to Hungate. So these 2 buildings here line up with that one, that lines up with that tenement, that lines up with that tenement, and that lines up with that one. So there is clearly a relationship between them. And this one probably lines up with a building that's just outside the excavation area there. So just to show you what these buildings look like, this one is the building you can see here. It's got a sill beam in the bottom and some post holes. This building here is this one, so it's this big rectangular pit here. Again, you can see the post holes around the side of it. That one was actually cut in 2 by a Victorian drain, which made a very nice barrow run for access into and out of that particular building. This one down here is this building. Again, you can see how delightfully wet the site was. So again, you've got a big rectangular pit with post holes around it. This one up here is that one there, and that pit is that pit in the middle. There was nothing in that pit that gave us any real clue as to its function. And the other thing you can see on this slide is those 2 stone walls. They are the stone walls of the earlier building that I just showed you. And it's possible that that entrance was actually reused as the entranceway into this building here. And finally, you've got this one here. You can see it's got a line of post holes going across it, and it's the only one that seems to be split into 2 rooms. By far and away, the best preserved of these buildings was building 1. I'll show you some pictures in a minute. But But this is a slide showing the ground plan of those various buildings. The top two are building 1. You can see that where entranceways survive into these buildings, they're usually on the gable end of the building. But in the case of this one, for some reason, they put the entrance midway along the longer side. This is building 1 up here, and this is absolutely critical to the dating of this site. It's by far the best preserved. It's been destroyed by a later pit in this area here, but essentially it's a rectangular cut, and it's got little post holes around the side, and it's got the traces of the horizontal plank walling, and the entranceway with the steps down is coming in at this end. We had one of the timber posts from this dendrochronologically dated, and it gave a date of AD 965, which is, because we know this is a planned settlement, it gives us a very good date for the settlement as a whole. It didn't stay like that for very long before it had to be massively repaired. So what they did was they cut away one end of the building, lengthened it slightly, and put in a new wall of exactly the same design. They also shored up the side walls with extra posts and beams, shored up the entranceway, and dug a pit in the middle with a post to either side. Now, again, we had one of the posts in that dendro dated, and it came to 969, which means that within 4 years of being built, they had to rebuild this structure. And it was clearly because the ground was just way too wet to cope with structures of this type, and the timbers were rotting very quickly. And in fact, every single one of those buildings shows signs of repair and replacement with new beams, new timbers, etc. going in. So that's the buildings. This is building 1 in a little bit more detail. Building 1 was dug in 2 halves. So the southern half was dug as a sort of test trench, and this is the test trench here, and you can see the building within it. That's it being excavated, and this slide shows you what the walls look like. So you can see you've got horizontal planks, one above the other, held in place by vertical squared posts. Oops, sorry. And this is the timbers in a little bit more detail. Put your slide up with the verticals in front and then without, so you can see the plank walling behind. You can see that we've got a maximum of 3 and a bit courses of planking surviving. So of course we don't know the full height of this room in its original form, and we also don't know for sure if it's a 1 or a 2-story building. And that's true of all the buildings on the site. One of the groups of timbers was particularly interesting. It's this one down at the bottom, because it's clearly part of a reused scrapped boat. So if you look at this slide here, which is the cross section through it, you can actually see the curve of the hull of the boat there. Again, we had a timber out of that dendrochronologically dated, and that came back as AD 953. And given that we know the date of the uprights in this building, we can work out that this boat was only 12 years old when it was scrapped and put into this building. And I should add that the reuse of planking from boats for building purposes is not unknown in the Viking period. It's very common on both houses and also on things like riverfronts and wharves. They quite often reuse boats for those purposes. So that's the buildings. We also had a lot of other features at the site, lots and lots and lots of pits. And some of these were these lovely lined wicker pits that you can see at the top. Some of them are very definitely cesspits. Some of them are very definitely rubbish pits. Some of them are cesspits that were later used as a rubbish pit. And some of them are rubbish pits that people occasionally used as toilets. So we've got the full range of pits. We also found lots of other wickerwork, including flat wicker panels. And this is one of the other Hungate trenches closer to what would have been the river, where they used wickerwork as revetments to sort of hold the water back, if you like. So you've got wicker fences held in place by vertical timbers. We found the usual array of Anglo-Scandinavian finds as well. Lots and lots of antler offcuts, so they were clearly working antler. There were bone and antler combs, and there was evidence of manufacture of them. The thing in the corner is red, it's amber, so they were working amber on the site. You've got hones made from a stone called schist, which is very, very characteristic of that period. Bone needles, and then the other two things are what are called buzz bones. So if you were to put a string through the hole in the middle and whiz it round like that, you get a buzzing sound. So it's a sort of very primitive poor man's musical instrument. Oops, sorry. So this settlement that we've got at Hungate represents by far and away the best evidence we've excavated to date for comparing to the famous Coppergate excavations, which you will all know about, I'm sure. This is Coppergate here. The street runs just behind that fence line there. And this shows the date of the various phases at Coppergate. And because we know that building 1 is 965, you can see that it compares very nicely with phase B at Coppergate, which is what you can see on the slide up here. So the two sites have an awful lot of similarities. At both sites, you get the division into tenements occurring in the late 9th century. At both sites, you've got very clear evidence for manufacturing and trade. And at both sites in the mid to late 10th century, you get the introduction of these semi-sunken timber buildings, and they are strikingly similar at the two sites. So if you compare this building at Coppergate with this one in the middle here, for example, you can see you've got your rectangular pit, you've got your little stairway into it on the gable end, you've got your little stone walls lining it, exactly the same as there. The only difference is that Coppergate is much better preserved. So in the case of Coppergate, you get these lovely sort of cavity wall affairs around the edge of the pit. So if you look down here, you can see you've got planks that line the pit. Then in front of them, you've got your vertical timbers, and then they've nailed more planks on the inside to give you a lovely wooden surface on the inside of your room. And you can also see that at Coppergate, we get floor joists preserved. Now, Hungate isn't that well preserved. What we're missing is the internal timbers here and the floor joists. And it might be because Hungate was very effectively robbed out. So that's why we're missing those pieces of timber. The other thing about Coppergate is the arrangement of period 5B. So if you can imagine the street is running here, you've clearly got buildings that front directly onto the street, but then you've got other buildings that are ancillary to them further back. And that may be exactly what we're seeing here. So if you imagine Hungate running down here, slightly to the southwest of its present position, you would have room for a whole pile of buildings there that could match these buildings. And these three buildings here could be the equivalent of these buildings slightly further back within the tenements. So the settlement doesn't last very long before the Normans, but it may have gone even before then. There's evidence for all of these buildings having been robbed out, and in some cases the timbers burned, and they were then infilled. And it's not possible from the dating evidence to say whether that happened before the Norman conquest, at the Norman conquest, or just after the Norman conquest. All I can say is that in the Norman period, there is next to nothing going on this site. So the green is the infilling of the Anglo-Scandinavian buildings, and the brown ones here are Norman rubbish pits. And you can see there's not much going on. The only other thing in this area that did happen in the post-Norman period was the founding of the Church of St. John in the Marsh, also known as St. John the Baptist. And you can see on this plan that it's right on the edge of the usable land next to a large lake known as the King's Fish Pond or the King's Fish Pool, which was created when the Normans dammed the River Foss. We didn't get the church within Area H, but we did get some of the burials, which are these things in yellow you can see there. However, we did see the church in some of the trial trenches and in a later excavation in this area directed by my colleague Arran Johnson. So I thought I'd put this slide up to show you the church. You can see that it's one of three in the area. This is St. John's, that's All Saints Pison Green, and that one up there is St. Saviour's. Now, we didn't get much of the ground plan of the church, but we did get a bit of each of the four walls. So we know exactly how big it was. So these are the walls of the church here. That wall is this one here with this modern drain going smack bang across it. And this one is that wall that you can see at the end there. The little grey things you can see in the test trenches are the graves associated with this church. And you can see that they don't extend very far to the northwest of the church. So most of the burials would have been either within the church or to the liturgical east, south, or west of the church. And this is very common in medieval churches. Generally speaking, you don't get as many burials to the north of a church as you do on the other sides of it. And just to show you what they look like, there's some pictures of the skeletons that we found there. So this shows what happens in the 13th century. The cemetery is still in use. You've got a cemetery soil in green here with burials above it. And then to the northwest of that, it's Rubbish Pit City. There are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rubbish pits. We don't know who's digging these rubbish pits, whether it's people who are living in the immediate vicinity or whether by this stage it's become a general rubbish tip for York and everybody's just turning up and, you know, getting rid of their rubbish down there. There's virtually no traces of any buildings or structures. There's one or two post holes scattered around. And the only feature of note is this thing running in this slightly curving line across the site. And this is a late medieval lane or road. And the reason it's in different colours is it constantly gets resurfaced and repaired, and they put little ditches next to it to drain it. And that's the only real feature of note at this period. From the 14th to the 16th century, there is an absolutely staggering decline in activity at this site. So if you compare those two images, the 300 years on the far image there is far less activity than the 13th century that you can see on the image closer to me. So what happens is that in the 14th century, we just carry on getting rubbish pits, the brown ones, but there's ever less of them. And then we get the cemetery contracting in size. The church is still in use in the 15th century, but clearly the cemetery to the north of it has gone. They're probably still burying people within it and to the south of it. And also in the 15th century, we get yet more rubbish pits, which are in blue, but we also get one building, which is that, if I can get the pointer to work, that foundation there. And unfortunately, again, it's right next to the edge of the trench. So I can't really say very much about it. And then in the 16th century, we get a few pits, and I really do mean a few, and they're in green on the slide here. So the church itself went out of use in the early 16th century. It's probably demolished soon after. And in 1585, this parish gets united with the parish of St. Saviour's. So it goes out of use absolutely completely. In the early 17th century, this site had clearly been completely abandoned. The John Speed's map that Lucy showed in her talk, on John Speed's map, this is just a complete blank. There's absolutely nothing here. So it's just used for horticulture. So that's a summary of what we found at the site. The next thing that we have to do is to look at the artifacts from the site, of which there are over 33,000. We want to see where all the different types of artifacts are, if they tell us anything about the use of the site. So for example, with those Anglo-Saxon tenements, was one of them for amber working, one of them for making combs, one of them for leather working, and so on. And we've also, of course, got to compare this site very carefully with Coppergate to look for both the similarities and the differences between them. So I hope this has given you an update on where we've got to. There's still an awful lot of work to do. And I hope also it's shown you why this site is so extraordinarily important for the history of medieval York, because it represents one of the best chances we've ever had to understand the Anglo-Scandinavian period. Okay, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Thanks, Jane. So questions now for Lucy, Adam and Jane from related to all those three talks. So Jane, don't run away. Any questions for any of those speakers? We've got the mic.
Huge thanks again to our first session speakers. That was excellent. Thank you for your questions. And welcome to the second part of the York Archaeological Forum annual conference. I'm Ian. I'm the chair of the York Archaeological Forum, which is a body set up to provide advice and support to the city archaeologist. Not that she needs a great deal of advice, but there we go. And I will say now, the vast majority of the work to put today on has been entirely down to Claire. So thank you hugely to her. And I will say that at the end as often as I can, so I can embarrass her. But this wouldn't happen without Claire putting all the work in. So thank you very much. Okay, the crack on. We've got 3 more presentations today. We've got my former colleague at the Trust, Ben Reeves, now of the City of York Council. And then we have my current colleague, Arran Johnson, and another former colleague, I've been here too long, in Andrew Jones, who will finish off the session for today. As before, we'll do a question sessions after each of the 3 speakers. And just to say that the volume of the PA in the room won't go any higher. So I have had a chat with the speakers just to make sure we're projecting properly and that people can see what we're saying. But if you do have problems at any point, just stick your hand up and we'll try and make sure we get that fixed. Okay, enough of me, over to Ben.
Thank you, Ian. Right, so after all that below ground archaeology, I'm going to talk to you a bit about some above ground stuff, a bit of conservation, a little bit of below ground archaeology, a bit of buildings archaeology as well. And so what I've tried to do is put together a selection of projects. We've been working on a number of things over the last year, but I've tried to put together a kind of a range of things just to give you a flavour of what we've been up to on the city walls. So to begin with, now many of you probably already know this, but for the benefit of others, the team, we're a team of 9, it's quite a small team. We have the Ancient Monuments Manager, the Ancient Monuments Project Officer / archaeologist, which is me, and then we have a team of masons and the mason supervisor. So we're quite a small team, and essentially our role is to look after the city walls, bars, posterns, ramparts, and also a little bit of other CYC heritage. So we do things on some other buildings and sites whenever we can, and we're trying to do more and more of that, really. So, but that's not something I'm going to go into much detail at the moment. So, core responsibilities, essentially maintaining, repairing, enhancing the city walls and all the other associated bits and pieces. And as I say, sometimes we've worked recently on the Mansion House. We've got a bit of work coming up, I think, on the Norman House off Stonegate, and hopefully upcoming some other heritage projects. So our role essentially is guided by the Conservation Management Plan. Donald Insall Associates produced this for our predecessor, Louisa Hood, in 2021. And this is essentially a document that sets out, you know, they looked at the whole of the city walls and produced this document, which is partly a heritage statement and partly a condition assessment of the city walls. And within that, there are lots of tables of the various elements of the structures and their condition, and they're all prioritized. So we basically, our work is led by that document. And we work very closely with Mason Clark Associates as well, who are our structural engineers, and other partners, which are listed there: Friends of York Walls, Red Tower, CIC, York Minster Conservation Trust, York Civic Trust, the York Mansion House, the York Archaeology Community Team, and the University of York. And there are probably others that I may have missed. So our basic maintenance program, essentially, this is the day-to-day stuff that our masons do, and that I'm partly responsible for managing. Tends to be things like, as you can see there, doors, windows, steps, railings and benches, replacing stones, the repointing, which seems like, well, it is an endless job. Essentially, as soon as you finish one area, there's another area that needs doing. And on and on. The other element of what we do is monitoring. So we have all around the city walls, there are tiny little brass, what's the word? Pegs in the wall, crack monitoring, essentially. So some of that's done manually. So we're looking at literally going out with a ruler, seeing whether the distance between these two studs in the wall has moved since the last recording. Cumulatively, the idea is we're getting an understanding of whether or not there are issues with specific areas. Now, of course, the walls do move with seasonal temperature changes and with moisture, so periods of rain, periods of drought. Essentially, the walls are built on the rampart. There's no real foundations. So those fluctuations in temperature and moisture mean that there are constantly periods where elements are moving closer or further apart from each other. So some of that movement isn't something to worry about. And so really it's about teasing out from this data whether there are issues developing in certain areas. The station frontage works. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about this project, but one of the elements we've been involved with is, again, monitoring, but this is also vibration monitoring. So when we know there's a big project, like the demolition of the Queen Street Bridge, or also at the Minster, where they're building the Centre of Excellence, when we know that there are big projects and there's big plant and potentially lots of soil movement, we're monitoring for levels of vibration. So of course, there comes a point where if there's a lot of vibration, that potentially could cause structural damage to the monuments. I'm glad to say that so far, there's not been anything specifically to worry about. So other than that basic maintenance and the monitoring, we have separate standalone projects. So I thought I'd talk about 4, one of which is we're calling York Walls in Bloom, which is more of an environmental and ecological project. The Monk Bar Ice House, which is one of our structural repair projects where we had a structural failing. Harlot Hill Tower, which again is another structural repair issue. And I've dug a little trench or 2 there, so there's a bit of below ground archaeology. And then Fishergate Poston Tower, which is in the roof space, which if you've not seen it, I recommend you go and look next time there's an open day with the friends, because it's an amazing roof structure, but we'll come back to that. So the York Walls in Bloom is at Station Road, and I apologise, I haven't produced any maps to show you where any of these things are. So it's assuming a certain level of knowledge of the walls circuit, but I'm happy to follow that up if anybody's got any questions. Station Road, which is just outside the building we're in today. This is how it looked at the beginning of summer, and our project essentially is part of a wider aim to improve the ecology of the city walls. So we're looking at, mostly looking at improving pollinator habitats, enhancing the existing heritage value of the monuments. And so what I'm going to do really here is just show you, I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about what we're planting, in terms of the exact species or anything, but I want to look at the site itself and show you a little bit of the sort of change over time, because it's quite an interesting little spot. So the ramparts as a whole have been identified as an important habitat for its flowery grassland, which we think is essentially the main source of nectar and pollen for insects in York. And of course, that supports the diets of bats and swifts and other birds that live in the city. So what we're trying to do is essentially use the existing resource and improve it. On this specific site, we're looking at a slightly different scenario, because this has been, for many years, been a site where we've always had formal beds, so a more formal planting scheme than the rest of the city walls, partly because it's often the first place that anybody visiting the city comes in, and this has been somewhere where there have been some quite amazing displays. And we'll see a few of those a bit later on. So this summer, we took a bold decision to extend and enlarge the existing beds, essentially the whole of these two areas on either side of the road here, and then plant them with perennials. So rather than having a system where we'd have to go back every year, take out the old plants and plant a new display, we're looking at trying to get the a wildflower planting in here so that it's essentially self-sustaining. And so as a landscape in the 19th century, as you can see, it's fairly rural. You've got sheep and cows grazing on the walls. There are some buildings. So this is the same area that we were looking at in the previous photographs. There's people hanging washing on the inside of the ramparts. I realized after sending these slides to Claire that actually it's not true, that there's been no archaeological investigation. I think on-site archaeology did a trench here in 2009 and got a little bit of the rampart. But essentially, this is an area that's not really been explored very much. Moving forward to the railway era, it's a very different picture. We've got railway sidings. The archways that you drive through today were put through in 1839 and 1847 to allow access to the original station. So this area essentially is quite industrial. It's full of railway carriages, but still being used for hanging washing. So there's still a bit of domestic kind of use of this space, presumably houses on the other side of the street, just out of that shop. We move forward to the period when the railway station was moved outside the city walls, and we see the first sign of a formal planting scheme. But actually, this is essentially it's shrubs, and I think you can just make out here group of individuals standing on the top of the wall, and it's really hard to tell because it's a postcard. But I'd love to get my hands on the original. I have a feeling they're probably the gardeners, just standing there for a hope. I assume they've just finished setting out that original scheme. So going further forward, this caused me a bit of a headache because the sequence didn't seem to make sense. But actually, the one on the left is earlier than the one on the right. It's just that it's been allowed to grow, and then they've done a bit of topiary, so it's made it all look very formal. And what's interesting is as we go forward, you see more and more formality. So going forward to 1930, they've taken out all of the shrubs in the northern bed, but there's still some in the southern bed. 1935, they've removed all of them. So we're moving forward towards having smaller, more decorative beds like this. Now, these look great. Problem with them is that they're not great for pollinators, and they're really expensive to put in, really expensive to maintain. So this is the kind of thing that people have got used to having in that space. And I have to say, it has been quite controversial. We've had a lot of negativity about doing the project, but hopefully when this all comes into bloom, literally, it will be an amazing display, and hopefully something for the city to be proud of. So that's the first project. If you want to find out more, there's some web addresses there you can look into for the York Walls in Bloom project. So the next one we'll look at is the Monk Bar Ice House. So this, as I said at the beginning, was essentially a repair project, relatively small one. But again, looking at the history of the site, realized that actually we don't know much about this building. We still don't. There's quite a lot of research that could be done. So ice houses, you probably already know, used for storing ice, generally used for preserving foods, luxury drinks, sorbets, syllabubs, ice creams. The first ones that we know of were introduced by James I at Greenwich Park and Hampton Court, but they became really popular in the 18th century. And the structure is usually a double-walled, cylindrical, conical, subterranean. thing. So essentially like an igloo buried in the ground. And they would pack them with straw and ice in layers. And the most important element really is keeping it dry, which I think is why this is in the ramparts, because the ramparts are well drained. It also means that when that structure needs cleaning out, it's quite easy to then essentially pull the plug and let it go out the bottom. Drains quite easily off into the moat. So the image at the top there is really hard to make out, but essentially our ice house is somewhere in that thicket of trees. And then we've got this from City of Our Dreams in 1940, which is the first photograph I could find. It's not there in Hargrove's 1818 map, but it is there in 1852. And we think it was built for the Bay Horse Inn, which is just, you can just see in the corner of that image, which is now the Keystones pub. And there it is again that's an enlargement of the City of Our Dreams image. 1977, it had obviously got to a pretty poor state, and it was, by the looks of this image, quite largely rebuilt. And then by the time we got to it, we were alerted to the fact that it was suffering a number of issues, particularly this bulge that you can see in that first image. So the brickwork is kind of sagging. So the project essentially was to remove some of that loose brickwork and rebuild it, and then repoint. So you can see we've got various separation in the brick joints, we've got the bulging, and then there's cementitious material here, which is all cracked. And so that's essentially what we were doing, is to take that apart. You can see the double skin structure. How much of this is original and how much is from the 1970s rebuild, we're not really sure. To fill in the hole, we reused as many of the bricks as we could, and then where we needed to, we used handmade bricks to fill in the gaps. And one of the interesting things is that this technology is coming round again, being rediscovered. This is the ground fridge. It's not technically an ice house, but it's interesting that for sustainability reasons, this technology is being rediscovered. And one of the things that we need to think about is what we do with this next, because it's kind of unloved. I'm sure a lot of visitors to York don't notice it, but it is a structure that really would be nice to have looked at and used more regularly. So watch this space. Harlot Hill Tower. This is, better move on a bit more quickly, I think, with this. So again, this is an interesting structure. As you can see, there are not many towers on the wall that have buildings sat on top of them anymore. It looks absolutely crazy. This is probably the reason why we've got some structural issues with it. I won't read through all of the history. Sorry. So Harlot Hill Tower is, it's the Dewberry area. So we're looking at near Layerthorpe. We access it from Old Walk. Yeah, I apologise for not giving you any maps. So the tower originally 1266 to 1318, but it was heavily restored in 1877. So that's the main thing really, is that they raised this parapet, and they also added some pepper pot bartizans to it, which I don't think I have an image of, I'm afraid. But the conservation issues inside, as you can see, huge stepped cracking, and then a massive joint separation here. So that's the gap you're looking at the bottom. And then this is a 1950s repair, which is, this is a steel girder encased in concrete. So some of these earlier conservation approaches might be contributing to some of the problems that the building's suffering now. And so what we're looking at really is ways of supporting this temporarily, and then in the future thinking about a way of coming up with a more permanent solution, and that might mean some extensive rebuilding, but that's something for the future, and also something we would need to seek funding. So our structural engineers have said that essentially, if we did nothing, it would last 20 years potentially. So it's not just want to, say it's not going to fall down immediately, but it's one of the issues we need to address. So I did a small investigation around the foundations, just to see really if there's any obvious explanation for the movement. Often when we do these, you dig a hole, you find clay and virtually nothing else, maybe a small bit of foundation. A lot of the walls aren't founded on very much at all. So this was a bit of a surprise, and I have to confess that I'm not really sure what any of this is. The structure that you can see here is probably Victorian, maybe a bit earlier. It's probably related to that building that you saw sat on top of the tower. This structure, which is on the other corner and presumably runs right the way through, it's probably this that you see here. So it's running from this corner right the way through. Not sure. That could be related to Civil War activity. So we know there's a gun hole here, and there must have been other structures related to that on the inside. So one of the things I'd like to do is investigate that. So with talking at the moment about enlarging, I think one of the things we don't want to do is undermine the existing structure. So we'll probably excavate in this area here, away from where the rear wall of the tower is, and see if there's any indication of what this structure is. So our structural engineers have come up with a solution, which essentially is a steel plate, which will be set into the blockwork, and that will support the 1950s beam. As I say, that's a temporary solution for the moment, but it should hold true for a number of years. So Fishergate Poston Tower, this one is a beautiful building. And as I said at the beginning, if you've never been up there, it's worth a look. So we're now other side of the city walls, right at the end of the walls where the River Foss is. This tower is quite scary to get up to the top floor. It's a very, very tight spiral staircase, but it's one of the best roofs that we've got, because virtually all of the other structures on the walls in the Victorian period or later, they've taken the roofs apart, replaced them completely. This one is quite different. The tower originally, we think, was built in 1502 to replace an earlier building. It almost certainly had a flat roof with crenellations around the top and probably a leaded roof. And then by the time of Speed's map in 1610, it's got a pitched roof like this. And again, in 1678, William Lodge, his illustration shows the same thing. So certainly by the late 1600s, it's got this pitched roof, probably as early as 1600. The structure itself, the roof structure, is all I'm going to focus on. So I'm not going to talk about the rest of the building, but the roof structure seems to be made from reused medieval timbers. We've got documentary evidence that it was used in the 1630s as a dovecot. So presumably somewhere, either through the crenellations or through the roof, there would have been an access point for the birds to get in and out. Again, this has had various stages of repair, retiled in 1740 and again in the 1950s. Some of the conservation issues that we picked up, it's particularly around this area, we've got cement. We'll see some pictures internally, but that's all rested on timbers. So you've got cement with brick behind it, rested on medieval timbers. The roof itself, as you can see, there's no ridge tiles along here. There is on the top, but we've got a little bit of water getting in through some of those. Some of the tiles have slipped, particularly around the eaves. So there are a number of issues that we can see immediately. I think there's some slip tiles there. But internally, it's actually not too bad. The 1950s work, you can see in these rafters. So these have been added in between the earlier timbers. And then this is the inside of the gablet that has the cement render on the outside. You can see the brick and then more cement render. But this timber here is really quite soft. It's still fairly solid, but there's certainly an ongoing issue with it. So the proposed interventions at the moment are in discussion, but essentially it needs a good tidy up. It needs the outside, we need to remove all the moss. We need to check that all of those tiles are secure, replace any missing pegs, and then do the torching on the inside. So that's where on the inside of the roof where the tiles are, they smear some lime mortar to hold all those together. The gablets, we're considering rebuilding those in something lighter, so they're not putting so much pressure on the roof. Maybe lath and plaster or something rather than the brick. And then some moderate repairs to some of the timbers, but that's something that we're keen to do as little as is necessary, really, because it's such an amazing roof structure that we don't want to replace things unnecessarily and smarten it up too much. One of the interesting things about it, I think, is the way that these timbers have been added to. I mean, this is a principal rafter that's been cut off, and then in the 50s they've added some new timbers on top. And again, here you've got the same thing. It looks worse than it is, but it's actually a really fascinating piece of work. So again, issues with this. We're working with the Friends of York Walls. It's very expensive to scaffold a building of this size, and so we need to think, if we're going to scaffold it and spend that money, then we need to also make sure that we do everything we can to ensure that nothing needs to be done for, say, the next 50 years to 100 years. Otherwise, it's not worth doing the work. So that's essentially me. So there we go. For more information, there's the City Walls Conservation area on our website, and then the Friends of York Walls as well. And there's my details and the City Walls manager, Liam Dennis. If anybody wants to get in touch with any questions, then feel free.
Ben, great. Opportunity for questions will be later on. So just while we do a quick mic swap. So our next speaker is Eric Johnson, who is Assistant Project Manager for the community team at York Archaeology, and he's going to talk to you about archaeology on prescription and Walmgate. Yep.
Thank you. Right, I'm a reasonably loud individual, so I'll attempt to orate pleasantly. So welcome to my talk about everything we've been doing at Walmgate. We've been there for some time now. Like Adams, this may be quite a breathless talk because I've put far too many slides in, so we'll move on very quickly. So the briefest bit of background. So Willow House is a City of York Council property. It's been closed and in a fairly rapid state of decay since 2017. And it's presently in the consultation phase for a redevelopment. And it's a cracking site archaeologically. We are within the city walls and right next to Walmgate Bar, which is just out of shot on the edge of that image there. Since 2021, we have hosted lots of projects on this site. So we have our award-winning social prescribing project, Archaeology on Prescription. We've hosted follow-on opportunities for graduates of that program. So there's a bespoke training excavation for them, and working with Ben quite closely in Historic England, beginning of a larger investigation of the ramparts in that area of the city walls. There's a public training excavation. There's our award nominated, or shortlisted rather, Kids Dig York, public open days, and an increasing public involvement with the consultation for the redevelopment. It's very much a community effort. It's people-powered archaeology from the off. And we really enjoy hosting multiple projects on this site because it broadens the access to the archaeology to a much more diverse audience to get the well-being benefits really of the participation with that. And it's also the bit that's really powerful for me. There's some meaningful archaeological research being done by a large cohort of non-professionals. So really opening the door into the profession. So speaking of the archaeology, we should probably talk about that. Oh, that slide's moved slightly. So we've got trenches everywhere there isn't a tree or a building, basically, and I keep finding new places to put them. So there's a good spread of trenches around there. And if I pop those onto the 1891 Ordnance Survey and just kind of go back, you'll see that that landscape is totally altered. Many of York's historic streets and historic plot boundaries survive with modern buildings set upon them. But this area has been basically bulldozed. More about that in a moment. Brief introduction to the broader research themes of the project. We were very interested from the outset in the 19th century kind of industrial revolution period, what it was like to live in an urban area with so much heavy industry. Then that transition from the kind of peak of the medieval activity into the slight decline in the post-medieval period, when it's broadly in agricultural use. And then the medieval period itself. You can see the nice lettering in the center of the image, site of St. Peter's Church. Could we rediscover a lost medieval church? I've rediscovered two, so I'm on for a hat trick, and I'm very hopeful for that. The Viking Age, going back even further, Walmgate is well known for the survival of Viking Age plot boundaries. Can we find any evidence of what life was like here at that time? Going even further back, the Romans were on the eastern fringe of the city, but we know Walmgate has its origins in the Roman period. We don't know a huge amount about what the Romans were doing here. And going even further, there have been some small pockets of prehistoric archaeology in the broader area, so we were hopeful to add a bit more information to that. To summarize what's been done archaeologically, let's take you back to 1973. I love this. There's no fencing. The site cabins are little wooden sheds, and you won't see a hard hat on anyone, I don't think. Very different. Some very nice cars as well, actually. What this image does show is that the amount of churn to the archaeology, they've not been terribly delicate. And the very fledgling York Archaeological Trust did some observations and promptly lost the archive, which is a shame. 2021, beginning our activity, far more civilized image here, as you can see. And we've been lucky enough to find evidence of activity spanning over 4 millennia. I love digging in York, there's nothing like it. So we're going to take you through some of the things we've been finding. So Victorian activity, what became immediately apparent is that when they've redeveloped the site, they've taken about 1 meter of archaeology with it, which is annoying. So the substantial building in the background there, all ground level deposits with that appear to have been lost. So we're only looking at deeper features. And these are not the most exciting things. There's a couple of little brick chambers for any brick chamber enthusiasts. Not entirely sure what they're for, actually. I've had some pretty wild theories, like a tiny toilet. But there are also some other services as well. But we do have some buildings, and we love a building. So let's return to the 1891 Ordnance Survey. We have walls for that building there and that building there, which thankfully has a fair bit of information about it. Hope Street British School, an early Quaker school, lasts from the 1820s through to the end of the 19th century, teaching things like the use of the electric telegraph. How modern. There was a parch mark on a piece of grass where we were really hoping would be the wall. And it was. And you can see there's not a great amount of soil on top of that brick wall you can see there. So those walls are from that front edge of the school. All floor and above ground deposits are gone, so we're limited to the foundations. But we were very excited about that. And our other building in the archaeology and prescription trenches, we've got a cellar. And we are yet to reach the base of that. We think it might be a corner shop. We've been trying to match up some of the buildings referred to in trade directories to buildings on the maps, but they keep knocking them down and building new ones. It's a very changeable landscape. I'd love to find the rubbish they couldn't be bothered to clear out of the cellar. There'd be no better insight into Victorian life. And of course, the disturbed area in the foreground of that image hasn't made a great deal of sense. We recently got a service plan that indicates it could be the present sewer for Long Close Lane. Very glamorous indeed. So let's go back to the post-medieval period. We've mentioned the loss of Victoriana. In the center of the image, you might be able to see a linear arrangement of stone, or a wall, for a better word for that. So that basically is the top of the post-medieval landscape. So you can see how close to the present surface that is. And if we talk about what we've actually found here, so at the bottom of the image, oh, there we go. So you've got a former route just running inside the city walls, which connect Fishergate Bar to the busy thoroughfare of Walmgate. But following a rebellion, Fishergate Bar was blocked up in 1489, and it wasn't reopened until 1826. So there's an ancient street which goes out of use, and a bit of foreshadowing, it will come back into use. And this is at a point when this is very much cows chomping on grass, nice bit of corn flowing in the wind. And we've managed to find the soil from this horticultural period, which appears just there. So in this section, you can see the darker grey deposit. This is currently the site of our kids dig York Trench. So the kids have been having great fun in this deposit. And it's at least 1 metre thick, so a very substantial layer. And we believe it is used for across several hundred years, which in terms of finds is fantastic because more modern material is pushed down, earlier material is brought up. So it's a real finds fest, which is great fun. Settlement activity for the post-medieval period has been able to be found. Our archaeology and prescription graduates did some research over the winter, and we found a microfiche with some of the original site archive from 1973. And they did seem to have, it's just in the top right of the image, a cobbled surface, which we believe is the medieval Willow Street. And they also had the wall you can see in the photograph, a stone and brick post-medieval building, which completely disrespected that road. It was built right on top of it. So a map here, you can see I've overlaid the kind of historic run of the streets on the modern map. So a building sat right over the road. These locations are approximate, but they're reasonably trustworthy. And that wall itself was made of recycled, quite nice limestone from an earlier building. Lost Church, a bit more foreshadowing there. Let's move on to medieval activity. So Trench 5, this was a trench I was really excited about until we opened it. And the amount of destruction here, the ground level you can see in the trench, that is the top of natural. So where the archaeology ends and the geologists join in. But we were lucky enough to have some quite substantial features, and the individual in the pit is kneeling down. I hasten to add, that's not a 2 metre deep pit. So we've got a series of pits and post holes. So we seem to be in the back gardens of medieval properties that go right up to the back of the city walls. And they are also absolutely full of finds. The pit that we're all excitedly gathered around, because we were slowly reassembling a medieval pot, had a little arrangement of post holes around it. There's several theories, but I quite like that parents didn't want the toddlers falling into the rubbish pit. But I'm open to other suggestions. And we had an absolutely whopping pit with a huge amount of burnt and butchered animal bone, which when that was in use would have probably smelled quite aromatic, to say the least. I love those more, gritty insights into life in the past. Medieval structures, these have only been coming up recently. So the original archaeology on prescription trench, that has really took a turn for the complex with a robbed out feature right in the corner of the trench where they always seem to be, which is very neatly filled with medieval masonry and rubble, which has been quite well sorted. I think we think someone's dismantled a building, sorted into the bits they want to take and reuse and the bits they want rid of, and they've just chucked them back in. And we've also had recycled medieval masonry in the footings of our school. So there's a little bit of stone just where the trowel's pointing with some quite clear tooling marks on it. Taken out of the ground, it's a beautiful piece of masonry from a medieval window. Medieval buildings with lovely windows, churches, hopefully. Jane assures me that is medieval, but I think that's all we've got. We've just got medieval in terms of dates. But a really lovely piece. We enjoyed cleaning that one up. And coming back to the church itself. So Trench 10, this summer's training excavation just in front of the main entrance to Willow House has come down onto a substantial deposit of limestone, tile, brick, all of which appears to be medieval. And we do have a little stub of a wall here. So it's getting quite complicated. We're hoping to revisit this trench for next year's training excavation. I've been referring to the church a few times, so I'll tell you what we know about it, which is not much. We've got a wonderful publication at York Archaeology about the parish churches of medieval York, and this has 2 paragraphs, which is quite impressive. So we don't know when it was built. We know it's a very small parish, but it does last for at least 3 centuries. It's first referred to in 1279 when it's the possession of Kirkham Priory. There's references to a chantry being founded in 1396 with cantorists, which is a word I hadn't heard until yesterday. I quite like. Active until 1431, but by this point the broader area is entering active decline and the church is disused by 1548-49. Sold to Alderman, sold to Alderman John North for £1 and eventually united with St. Margaret's in 1586. So we've been trying to work out where this church is. Well, it's quite helpful, but on the historic mapping, they say St. Peter's Church site of, but there's not a great deal of archaeological evidence for that. So we've been trying to figure it out, looking at evidence we've seen from other sites in York, and that is our best guess for where the precinct of this church is. You'll see the buildings close to Walmgate itself are quite short, truncated plots of land when compared to the ones next to them. And there are some odd angles which may explain the previous use of the site. So this is only a theory, but permit me a moment of wild speculation. Returning to this image, you may notice that some of the brick and tile is laid nice and flat, and some of it is quite clearly angled. If you draw a line around that, you get a nice big rectangle. So could we see rubble slumping into a deeper buried feature, perhaps the robbed out wall of a church or building associated with a church? Maybe. If I put that on the map, it'd be approximately there. Let's make an imaginary church. There we go, we found the church. Hooray! Job well done. So we're currently working on actually doing some real archaeology rather than just wild speculation. And some geotechnical investigations for the redevelopment has identified a couple of spots where we do have in situ human remains roughly over here. And to the other side of that line, no human remains. So the presence and absence of that is going to be really helpful as work progresses. Let's go further back in time. So early medieval period, we don't have any in situ archaeological features yet. However, the volume of residual finds from this period is steadily growing as we get deeper. So the auguries are good. And we've finally started finding some personal objects as well. And I think Lucy bested me with the quality of combs because that's ours, which I think is lovely. Small but perfectly formed piece of antler there that our trainee John was very pleased with from this summer's dig. Trying to round us off now, bringing us back to the Roman period. So we've had a huge amount of residual Roman pottery in all of our modern and later layers. So there's clearly suggestion of a bit of a hotspot of activity. And only this year we found the first in situ Roman deposit, and it's just 60 centimeters underground. And there's Alice, who's present today. The Google Street View van drove past when we were digging this. If you go down to the end of Long Close Lane, you can see us actively digging that. So Alice is standing in that trench, and that Roman deposit goes beyond 1.2 meters. So whatever it is substantial. This is the trench where we've just been looking at those tiles. So we're hoping to dig more of that next year. So watch this space for more updates. So loads and loads of lovely Roman pottery out of that. And it's mainly your Samian wares and your Nene Valley wares. So not quite your Aldi pottery, much more Waitrose standard stuff. And there it is. It doesn't look like much, but that is actually some really exciting clay. And it's not often that you'll get Roman deposits so accessible within the city walls of York. So that's really exciting. And yes, we don't know what it's for, but there is at least one publication that refers to a Roman road running over this trench. That would be pretty cool. And to finish up, let's have a look at some finds. Certainly one of the stars of this beautiful intaglio stone featuring Mercury. And if you look really, really closely, you can see winged sandals and the caduceus and the bag of money. So someone would have been very cross when that stone fell out of a ring. So they were no longer pressing their seal into wax to authenticate their death warrants. So very annoyed by that. A curious one actually from the post-medieval period is this little object here, which says Manchester on the top. This is a 17th century tradesman's token, kind of like buying a voucher for a shop. Now, this is very much a live excavation and we haven't had specialist assessment of any of the finds yet, but Google tells us that these are mainly found in and around the Greater Manchester area. So this might be the first one found beyond it. If anyone's particularly knowledgeable about tradesman's tokens, do come and call me afterwards. I'd be interested to hear it. Our oldest find, we alluded to prehistory. Well, we have it. There is a beautiful early Bronze Age flint arrowhead that came out of a 1970s made ground level, where I'd insisted the steps into the trench should be, and one of my colleagues overrode me and found this. So I was proved wrong on that one. But it's wonderful to imagine a find that is older than York. So someone stalking small animals around some willowy woodland is quite nice to see. And of course, the pièce de résistance, Smith's Crisps, top deck shandy. This is one of the most wonderful things about bringing non-archaeologists into archaeology, because we're quite trained. We think about things in a certain way. And I love the finds that people that haven't had that conditioning, what speaks to them? You know, someone said this is the archaeology of me. The top deck shandy, there's some pretty misogynistic advertising campaigns on YouTube. And the Smith's Crisp packet, you could send a post order of 15p and get a magic pad. Imagine that. So that is a huge amount of archaeology condensed to hopefully quite a brief talk. But in conclusion, I'm really, really keen to do more of this. I think bringing the public, local residents into the investigation and placing them as protagonists is quite a powerful thing to do. We've got a lot of trenches, but a lot of them aren't terribly deep. So it's quite light touch archaeology. We're not removing great amounts of soil, but we really are adding a lot of colour to an area that has not had a huge amount of modern excavation. And adding to the growing evidence, the prehistoric activity is particularly exciting. I know the Venerable Ian Milstead had some Bronze Age cremations just down Lawrence Street, or Ben, sorry. Yeah. Together, the double acts of Ben and Ian. Yes, so we know that people are using this area at this time. Can we find more? Cross your fingers for us. And just as we've got towards the latter ends, you know, hopefully into the final year of this next year, it's getting complex with Roman, medieval and post-medieval. So we've got big plans in place for 2025, and we're working very closely with the design team for the redevelopment. So hopefully keeping those opportunities to involve local residents, because crucially, that's the best thing about working in partnership. City of York Council have been wonderful to work with on this, as have the design team. But for me, I think bringing in the community and hearing their perspectives and letting them find all the nice finds, because all of those lovely finds were all found by non-professional archaeologists. So it's been a wonderful project, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Arran. Not sure I'm quite ready to be called venerable just yet, you cheeky bugger, but no, that was really good. And yeah, and just other hat on, I manage the community engagement team for York Archaeology. Arran's obviously one of my colleagues. And the work that's been done up there has just been so much fun, apart from anything else. But really proud also to have been engaging with social prescribing. People are actually coming there for their own benefit, not for others. That's been a very important part of our work there. Right, I'm going to stop talking. Last but very much not least, we have Dr. Andrew Jones, who's going to talk to you about Friargate. And I'm going to step down and let him do that.
Okay, lovely. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to come today and speak to you. This is a project that slipped through the heritage management net a little bit. We started in late 2012 at the Quaker Meeting House, and I'm sure most of you will be familiar that the Quaker Meeting House runs off Castlegate, which is the extension of the Roman road that ran along the River Ouse to the south of the Roman fortress, all the way along to the castle. And this was a major road. Now Castlegate's quite enclosed and small, doesn't look very significant, but it's a major access route through to the castle. And in Roman period led to a burial ground at the confluence of the two rivers. So it's a historically really ancient and interesting area. And the Quaker Meeting House decided to, which one am I going to push? Sorry. Oh, I was pushing it backwards. Decided that in about 2010, it was necessary to improve the access to the building. This is quite a very small project. I hope you can make some sense of this. This is this the pointer? That one. Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks. Oh, wrong one. Go back. The pointer. This is an alleyway that runs into the alleyway runs in through from Clifford Street along here, and Friargate is running. Oh dear. Oh gosh. Friargate. My dexterity of this is Friargate's running somewhere down here, the little alleyway. And all that was being dug was a small area just here to build in a new staircase and a new garden room. So you can see this is only a few meters square. But what was important was that this building, this garden area at the back of the Quaker Meeting House had been subdivided by a garden wall, which you can see here on this plan, that ran across and joined up to the meeting. The other important feature is within the basement of the Quaker meeting. Some of you may know this. There's a room now known as the Woolman Room, and along this wall here, within the Woolman Room, there is exposed an ancient medieval wall, which is believed to be the boundary wall of the medieval friary, the Franciscan friary that was built there in the 13th century. So it's a small community project. In this area close to the castle. This is Ridsdale Tate's marvelous reconstruction. You can see York Castle here. This is the St Mary's Castlegate Church here, I think. And this here is the where he thinks the medieval friary was. So we're in a really interesting area, but this had become developed with a number of water lanes that ran down from Castlegate to the river surface, the river quay here, Friargate quay. So there's a number of water lanes running down. And this is the famous 1852 historic map, which is published in the Historic Towns Atlas for York. Gosh, this is too fiddly for me. And you see Friargate running down here. Clifford Street doesn't exist, and this is the Quaker Meeting House built here. And the wall for the boundary wall of the priory runs about here through the building. What we've also got on this map here is the very impressive structure of Castlegate House, now a Masonic lodge. And what you can see, 18th century Masonic lodge, which was built with extensive gardens that formerly ran all the way down towards the river here. And that over time, bits of the gardens of the Castlegate House have been bought up by the meeting house to this section here to become the garden of the present day meeting house. So it's a complicated area which has been developed over a very long period of time. And this is within the Woolman Room. Here in the basement, the present basement, you can see these large medieval ashlars here are running along, which are thought to be and identified as the remnants of the boundary wall of the friary and indeed York Castle, the Norman castle. Because what happened was when the friars came along wanting to build a friary in York, the king gave a large area of the castle to the friars. So this is probably the north wall of the Norman castle was and then extended with medieval brick. So that's still visible in the basement of the churchyard. So we knew we were in an important area. Now I'm old enough and been in York long enough to be there when the last phase of redevelopment at the Friargate was undertaken. And most regrettably, a fine Regency Quaker meeting house had to be completely demolished in the 1980s because the roof was insubstantial, it was falling down, the building was not safe. And after a lot of debate, the new rooms were created there, and the meeting house now just uses the smaller of the two meeting rooms. And that was a time when the archaeological excavations in York, some archaeological excavations, were carried out by a group called the York Excavation Group, who had been on site for several months looking around and found nothing of any significance. However, right at the end of the building development, once the building had been put up, new steps had to be cut from the patio of the meeting house down into the garden. And in that process, the builders, right at the end of the project, came across a small group of human skeletons. And there was nobody around to study them. And so what people decided to do, and you can just about see this on this photograph that comes from 1983, is these human remains were buried in a plywood coffin next to the wall in the meeting house, which is, for those of you who know the meeting house and the U3A activity centre there, it's just there was where these bones were buried. And this is exactly the site where the new building work, the new stairs and the new lift, which I've shown you earlier, were to be built. So our activities at the Friargate Community Archaeology Project was basically to record and help demolish the garden wall, to investigate wall foundations, and we were aiming to recover these human remains and possibly see if we could do some more work with them. So that's what we did. And for, during the spring of 2013, we carried out these simple investigations. We had to clear, the site, sorry. Oh gosh. We had to clear the site of trees and so expose the garden wall. And it was immediately clear that this garden wall, although probably a 19th or maybe late 18th century wall, contained a lot of medieval ashlars, including 2 substantial worked stones. And here is a very historic picture, because this is when we did our health and safety briefing, and John Kenny, who is in the room here today, was engaged to carry out that work. And we produced newsletters detailing our activities. One of our members was an artist, and she did some watercolors of the proceedings. We worked with kids doing all sorts of work. We spent an enormous amount of time cleaning up bricks, removing from mortar, so that the stones from the garden walls could be sold on. Yes, and we removed these very large stones for further work. We also organised activities for children and had an open afternoon which culminated on the 26th of August 2013, which was a bank holiday. And it was on that day that we managed to locate and remove the plywood coffin full of the remains. The stones were, I'm not an architectural historian, I know nothing about the stonework. So we engaged Leslie Collett from YAT to come and draw these stones for us, and then asked around for people who could recognize these stones and see what they could think they were. And Stuart Harrison, who's now the Minster archaeologist, came along and declared that these 2 stones were part of a Carnarvon arch, which is a sort of a doorway that was initiated in the UK at Carnarvon Castle and became a standard 13th century doorway. And we think now that these 2 stones are likely to be some of the remaining fabric of the medieval Franciscan friary, a doorway, and the stones are still sitting in the garden. So that's a little bit of we've made sense of these. And what's interesting is that certainly with much help from the Historic Towns Atlas, we now think that the dividing garden wall that we had to completely demolish, well, it came from one of the garden walls in Castlegate House. And what's interesting is when that was built in the late 18th century, the people built and deliberately put these stones on show so that they could have been visible from the river. And the Castlegate House was built for a chap called Johnson, who was the chief legal beagle for York. So what we're seeing here is an exertion of authority. There's a new legal authority imposing itself on the city, making itself visible near the castle, and incorporating medieval stones from the earlier friary into its garden wall. So I think it's an interesting little bit of historical evidence that we've got from this. We've also done some work on the bones. We've cleaned up the bones and had various people studying them. We started off with, and here there's Jenny Geddes Jenny Geddes. Jenny, let me find you again. Jenny Geddes is in the group here, was one of our members, original members of our group. And I should have said at the onset that this was a deliberate community project involving the U3A and members of the Quaker meeting and anybody else who we could attract to get involved under the auspices of the YAT. And we had students from the University of York help. These are master's students looking at the bones to try and make sense of this. No complete skeletons were present. The first look at this by the students identified 3 or 4 bodies. They weren't absolutely certain. We then had another volunteer came along. He was got a PhD from Cambridge, and he thought that there were 4 people present. And most recently, Rose Drew, who is a fully qualified human anatomist, has come along and identified the bones, confirming the results of the earlier students, but also recognizing that one of the skeletons in this group looked to her to have negroid characteristics, which was very surprising because we didn't know who these bodies belonged to. They could be anybody. They could be Roman burials, they could be medieval burials, they could be post-medieval burials. So the presence of a possible negroid skeleton was very intriguing. And so what we've consequently done is get involved with the Carr C14 dating, where you can take, which is administered by the CBA, where community groups can submit samples for C14 dating. And that we've recently, just this summer, had the result of that work, and that's demonstrated that these bones are from the mid-17th century, or at least one bone. We were only allowed to submit one bone, but it's one bone from one of the bigger skeletons from the mid-17th century. So we're now thinking that these skeletons are much more likely to be early Quakers from the site. The further historical research, we've found this map, this 17th century map of York, and what this shows is the castle over here, Castlegate running down here, St Mary's Church there, and the Friargate running down here. And we believe that this building here might be the earliest representation of the Quaker meeting house. And if you notice, what the building plot here is stretching over towards the back of the castle. This is Tower Street running around here. And when Patrick Ottaway and team carried out excavations on Tower Street, they found a small number of human burials here, which were then interpreted as possibly medieval friary burials. It's not fully published, just mentioned in interim, the YAT journal at the time. And we're now pretty convinced that these are exactly where the Quaker burials are. So although it's been a slow project, with the passing of time, we've managed to, we are almost certain that we've got the first Quaker burial ground in York, which has been long forgotten. There's a well-known Quaker burial ground in Bishop Hill, and of course there's a huge Quaker burial ground at the Retreat. But it seems as though the first Quaker burial ground was actually in Friargate here, and this is one of our discoveries. So although this is a very small project, I think we've managed to get what Philip Raats would call a decent value for our effort. Philip Raats thought that archaeological projects should be measured in a unit called the hist. Have you all heard of the hist? These are units of historical valuable data that you can get from your archaeological excavations. And I think we've got two areas where we can get a hist point. One from the identification of the Carnarvon arch, tying that into the fabric of the medieval friary, and two, the evidence from these Quaker burials. And we're currently looking at Quaker burial records, which show that there was indeed a friary, a Quaker burial site at Castlegate. It doesn't, obviously, there's no plans associated with it, but the names of people are identified. And one of the skeletons that is recorded in those records is of a man called John Ye Planter from Maryland. So if you tie that up, and I think it's a reasonable thing to do, to tie this in with our possible Negroid skeleton, we think we may have early 17th century American people in York. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thanks, thanks, Bo. So, beautifully on time. The live stream has now stopped, and we move into the questions part of the session. So Claire's going to be doing the roving light.
What's happening there?
Not me. Okay, good, fine. That happens again, it's not my fault. So please, for our three speakers from the second session, for Ben, for Arran, and for Andrew, are there any questions? Don't be shy. Yep, we have a couple in the room.
I've got one for
Ask the speakers.
I've got one for Arran. Just where one of the things that was found in the